Hello, everyone. My name is Kathy Barr, and I am Vice President Research and Strategic Relationships at Imagine Canada for a little bit longer. And I'm also chair of the Federal Nonprofit Data Coalition. It's my pleasure to extend a very warm welcome to everyone here. We're so happy to have all of you join us for this deep dive into the results of an exciting new survey of the sector from Statistics Canada. However, before we get into that conversation, we'd like to begin by taking a moment to acknowledge the physical and virtual spaces and the lands that we're joining in from today. I'm going to read Imagine Canada's land acknowledgement. Feel free to put your own land acknowledgements or the territories that you're in the chat. Imagine Canada's staff, operations, work, and network depend on traditional Indigenous territories to provide us physical space, sustenance, safety, and community to work, live, and play. Our physical head office is located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat. We acknowledge that these lands are covered by Treaty 13 and the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. We acknowledge that these lands are still home to many diverse nations, Métis and Inuit people. We acknowledge that our ability to live and work on these lands today is a direct benefit of policies of expulsion and assimilation of Indigenous peoples during the time of settlement and confederation and since. The harms of these policies are many and are still being felt in Indigenous communities today. We express gratitude towards the Indigenous peoples who have and will continue to steward these lands. We commit to amplifying the voices of Indigenous peoples and working against the everyday forces of white supremacy and colonialism present in the nonprofit sector. Our team is actively engaging in training and education related to reconciliation and decolonization. We aim to listen, learn, establish meaningful relationships with our Indigenous sector colleagues, engage in courageous conversations, and take actions that advance reconciliation in the nonprofit sector. Our work at Imagine Canada is long-term and multi-generational in nature, and we recognize that it will be a continuous and intentional process to build strong relationships with our Indigenous colleagues and connect with the land. Today, our guest speaker is Sébastien Larochelle-Côté from Statistics Canada. Sébastien will give a brief presentation, and then we'll transition into a discussion and take some questions from the audience. Please note that you must use the official Q&A function in order to participate, as we won't be taking questions from the chat. You can submit your questions at any time, but we'll answer them towards the end of the session. This meeting is being recorded, and you will receive the recording within a few weeks, along with related resources. Closed captioning is enabled. And if you have further accessibility questions, please let us know in the chat, which is being monitored separately by my colleague, Emily Jensen. So just before Sébastien introduces himself and gives the presentation, I just wanted to introduce a little bit of context. This webinar is being organized by the Federal Nonprofit Data Coalition. This group focuses on advancing the nonprofit sector's priorities in terms of data collected and shared by the federal government. It currently includes representatives from more than 40 organizations and institutions. If you're interested in learning more about the Federal Nonprofit Data Coalition or are interested in joining, please get in touch with us at publicpolicy@imaginecanada.ca. The purpose of this webinar is to build the sector's awareness of sector data and its capacity to use it to further our missions. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Sébastien. If you could take a minute to introduce yourself and where you sit within Statistics Canada, and then you can present the results of this great survey.
Thank you very much. And I will start by saying that I'm talking to you from Ottawa, which is built on unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. And I would like to honor the peoples and land of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. Algonquin, sorry. And I would like also to honor all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people and their valuable past and present contributions to this land. So a word about myself. My name is Sébastien Larochelle-Côté. I am the director of the Center for Special Business Projects here at Statistics Canada. And I would like to start by thanking, in fact, the coalition for the organization of the webinar. I would like to thank Imagine Canada, of course, who provided great support. And I would like to personally thank Kathy as well. Kathy has been a champion of the sector for many, many years. Kathy is also a longtime partner of this organization. It's been a real pleasure to work with you, Kathy, over the past year or so on the development of that survey, and I really hope that our collaboration will continue in the future. So without further ado, if we could put up the presentation on the screen and get started, I guess, on the results. So let me jump into the next slide, if you will, on the agenda, and which provides some details about what I will be covering today. The first thing that I will be talking about is how this survey came to be. So essentially, what is the background? What is the sample? What are the definition? What is it that we were trying to achieve with this survey? Then I will do a deep dive into the results, and of course, it will provide you with a few numbers, not all the numbers. We have a lot more information, and all of this information is available, publicly available on the website of StatsCan, www.statscan.gc.ca. And so I invite you after this presentation, and you will see a few links, and I believe this presentation will be shared. There are some links in the presentation that you can use as well to access the information. And I will conclude this presentation by talking about the other initiatives in this organization that could be of interest to the sector. So how this came to be, which is the topic of the next slide. So we were presented with the opportunity to collect information for the sector as per a larger initiative that is called the Disaggregated Data Action Plan, the DDAP. So the Disaggregated Action Plan was a whole of government approach to improve statistics on diverse populations. So in the words of the former chief statistician of Canada, he said that and I think that that was a very good quote. He said the days of the national averages are over. We need more information for specific population groups. We need more granular information for not only for diverse communities, but also for diverse population groups. And so this is what DDAP is all about, right? How can we build more, how can we change the infrastructure to build more and to generate more information for these various groups, and not only in terms of the amount of information, but also in terms of the techniques, right, that can be used to generate more. And the nonprofit initiative came out of that. So we got a little bit of these, a small portion of these funds, I suppose, to do a survey on nonprofit organization, which was the first time that we did a survey on the nonprofit since 2003. So if we go to the next slide, what we decided to do was to leverage an already existing survey to do the survey on nonprofits. So this survey is called the Canadian Survey on Business Conditions. So this is a survey that we conduct every quarter, and nonprofit organizations have long been part of that survey. But we decided to use this infrastructure to add a module specifically for nonprofit organization. So this is a survey that we, as I said, is being released on a quarterly basis. Typically provides information on what the situation of businesses are, what type of situation they are facing, the obstacles that they face, their long-term outlook and perspectives, and so on and so forth. So it is very flexible in terms of infrastructure because it exists. It's already there. So for us, it was very easy, in fact, somewhat easy. I shouldn't say that it was very easy, but it was somewhat easy to add a module and extend that survey specifically to a nonprofit organization and add a few questions that were absolutely specific to the nonprofit sector. So what we decided to do is that we decided to assemble an external advisory group made of close to, and that is explained in the next slide, next made of, thank you, 25 to 30, I would say luminaries, experts of the sector, and they came from, different areas of the nonprofit sector, which included people from the academia, people from some organizations, for example. And so we had a very wide perspective around the table. And this was absolutely necessary for us to have that perspective, because it really helped us prioritize what information was needed. And so, one of the things that were mentioned was more information about the diversity of the sector. We know that this is a sector, the sector is very diverse. More information on the demographics, on board of directors, for example, on senior management of organizations. More information on the funding sources and expenditures, on the capacity and demand, population served as well, because there's a very wide range of population served. We saw that in the results. And also information about the volunteering activities, right? So those were the large themes that were covered in the and almost every, to be perfectly honest, almost every answer to these questions was interesting. Okay, and if I have one overall conclusion that I can, that one takeaway from this, if there is one takeaway from all the results that you're about to see, is that the sector is extremely diverse in terms of all of these issues. That, I will certainly show you a few percentages for the overall sector, but if you take a deep dive into the certain categories, be it by size or by type, I mean, there's wide variations in what we found for all of these issues that have been mentioned, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So, in the next slide, I explain that we use an already existing definition. Of course, in the area of stats, we're forced to follow international standards, which is the case here, right? I mean, we have a well-defined set of standards with respect to the nonprofit sector. And so we're using something, a definition that already exists, that has been implemented in this organization, that is being used by something we call the satellite account of nonprofit institutions and volunteering. I'm going to go back to the satellite account at the very end of my presentation. This is very important because it does provide information on the economic contribution of the sector. Did you know, for example, that the sector is a 230 billion sector? So the economic contribution of the sector is very large. It has 2.6 million people working in it, and it represents 8.4% of GDP. So we're talking about numbers that are quite significant. You can divide up the sector into three major categories. The first is community nonprofit institutions, which includes organizations engaged, for example, in social services, advocacy, or sports and recreation. Then you have business nonprofit institutions, which includes business associations, chamber of commerce, condominium associations, for example. And then you have government nonprofit institutions, which include hospitals, residential care facilities, for example, universities and colleges. So another very large sector. So that gives you a lay of the land as to which types of organizations are included in it. I want to mention that all of the results are available across regions of the country, across sectors. We have 13 of them, and I'm going to provide some results in a minute, and 5 employment size categories. Okay, so this is the level of detail that you can access. So you're going to see a few high level numbers, but all of these details are available. So the module that I'm talking about had 8,000 nonprofit organizations that we contacted that are representative, right, of the sector at large in the country. And we had a fairly good response rate. And I want to thank you, the few of you probably that might have received the questionnaire, because the response rate was in fact a little bit higher even than what we typically see in the CSBC. So I want to thank you for that. And I want to thank also Imagine Canada because they also made a push from a communication perspective to help spread the word about the survey because of course the higher the response rate, the higher the quality of the estimates always. And so this is something important not only for this one but also for future iterations if they happen. So if we move on to the next slide, this will give you again a lay of the land across the 13 areas of, I would say, uh, shall we say, activity, right? Primary activity that the sector is engaged into. What this says is that if you do the sum of all these percentages, it adds up to 100%, right? And so that this says that 33%, so 1/3 of all nonprofit organizations in this country are related to sports and recreation. Then close to 20% are religious, in fact, organizations. 8.8% are grant-making, fundraising, and volunteerism promotion organizations. We have 8.5% in social services, 6.9% in development and housing. Wanted just to point out the fact that if you go down the list, I mean, 1% in health, these are typically large organizations, I will say that, right? If you think of hospitals, for example, of course, you can have one organization that has multiple employees in it that has a lot of impact. Might be the same thing for environment, but as a proportion of the organization in the sector, it's a relatively small proportion. But again, in the sector, you have organizations that are super large, organizations that are super small, and in some cases have even no employees at all, right? So, and this is again to underscore the huge diversity of the sector and the reason why we needed to have this information disaggregated across the categories that we have. So next slide will tell you about what are the primary groups served by the nonprofit organization in this country. It doesn't mean that this is the only group that they are serving, right? They can serve more than one group. But we asked the organization, what is the primary group that you are serving? And we do see that a large proportion, 42%, uh, uh, right, said that they. So there's a little bit of a mistake, I think, in this one. Although in the copy that I have, it says 42. Maybe this is a bit of a. So I'm not sure that this one has the right numbers, but and I think it might be because we're missing one. Anyway, so the real number for the primary group served, like the general public, this is 42%. Okay. And if I go to children or youth, okay, so the numbers in it is 14.2. I think it's probably a matter of not having the right box size here, I believe. So that's a reason why the numbers are all over the place. So children or youth, okay, so we have 14% of organization that said that their primary group served was children or youth, okay? So if I look at then people of a particular religion or spiritual affiliation, the number is 9%, okay? So, and then we have seniors, 5%, families, 4%, low-income household or individual, 3%, and people in occupation, in particular occupation or occupations or union members, and we have many organizations related to that, right? Close to 5%, 4.7% to be exact. Women, 2.4% of organizations are primarily dedicated to women, and people living with mental health conditions is close to 2%. Okay, so all the other groups and we have, of course, a variety of groups in it, but I mean, for the purpose of the presentation here is 3%, right? But they consist of a variety of different groups, okay? Give you an example, people living with physical health conditions, we have 1.5 of all organizations in this country that says that, that say that they are the primary focus of the organization. First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples, 1.5%, okay, of all organizations in this country have them as the primary group served. So let's go to the next slide, since this one appears to have a few problems in it. And this one seems okay. So I'm glad we don't have any problems with this one. So let's talk about diversity, which is very important. So we did ask about the composition of the boards of directors. So essentially, we've been asking the question as to whether what is the proportion of people are women, right? So about close to half of all board of directors, right, are filled by women. Okay, which is interesting, right? And if you think, and if you look at the members of racialized populations, right, which is the second category here, um, about around 1/10 of all board of directors are filled by members of racialized groups. Okay. But this again varied by, and you also have the results of people with disabilities, First Nation Métis, or Inuit and non-binary persons. But I just wanted to emphasize the fact that these results really vary across different types of organization. Okay, and I'm going to give an example in the next slide. Right, um, this is the proportion of women, right, in on board of directors, and as you can see, if you look at organization related to social services, it is 70%, right? In terms of the proportion of positions that are filled by women on the board of directors, 70% in social services. And if you look at grant making and fundraising, it's 48%, so closer to the national average. And if you look at religious organizations or professional associations, you have a lower percentage of board members in these organizations that are women. Okay, maybe not necessarily a surprise, right? But it shows the variety again, the diversity of the sector. Same thing if we were to have a slide like that on racialized populations, it would be also varying across different groups. In that area, members of racialized population, they seem to be more represented in religious organizations. And if memory serves, I mean that proportion was close to 20% for religious organizations. So that's interesting. If we go to the next slide, it is about volunteering. And this, in fact, shows that categories appears to be supported by volunteers, right? I mean, there's quite a bit of degree, quite quite a lot of organizations in all of the sectors that benefit from the help of volunteers, and this is over 90% in the organizations that are involved in arts and culture and religion, law, advocacy, and politics. Right, it's a little bit lower. 64% for business and professional associations and unions. But from if you look at this from an overall perspective, you can see that there's volunteers appear to be involved everywhere, right? And we also have a survey in this organization that is asking Canadians about volunteering, the extent to which they are involved in a nonprofit organization, and how many hours they dedicate to volunteering activities. And I'm going to present just a glimpse of these numbers at the very end of this presentation. Okay. Let's talk about finance. The other one before that, please. Thank you. That's the right one. So what is the most frequent source of funding, right? And emphasizing, of course, we know that for many organizations have more than one source, right, of funding. So we decided to ask what was the most prevalent source of funding for organizations. And we do see that for 22% of organization of nonprofit organization, the most important source of funding was individual donations. Membership dues close to 20% again, that's 18% to be exact. And also 11% of organizations reported that their main source of funding was from provincial and territorial funding. There's of course, we have other categories. I'm showing you the main. But again, emphasizing the fact that The story is very different depending on the type of organization that you're looking at. For example, if you look at individual donations, registered charities are much more dependent on individual donations than other types of organizations. Same thing for organizations that have only a few employees, 1 to 4 employees. 32% said that they primarily relied on individual donation. Now, if you look at membership dues, not necessarily a surprise here, but close to 50% of them said that membership dues were their most important source of funding, right? And there it says nonprofit, it should say unregistered nonprofit. It's 29.1% that are dependent on primarily on membership dues. Interestingly enough, if you look at provincial and territorial, I don't think this is going to come up as a surprise, but still, if you look at health organizations, 44% said that provincial and territorial was their primary source of funding. But again, I mean, since health is primarily a provincial jurisdiction, then maybe this is not that much of a surprise. And organizations that are in the middle range in terms of employees, 20 to 99, also reported that they were slightly more dependent on that source of funding. So, as you can see, quite a bit of variation again, which shows the diversity of the sector. The next slide is one of the ones that we highlighted, in fact, in the press release that we did in the daily, and it shows capacity and demand for the services that are provided by the sector. So we asked organization if over the past year, if the demand for their services increased, stayed the same, or decreased. And you will see from that slide that close to one half, 46% of nonprofit organizations mentioned that they had seen an increase in the demand for their services. Okay. But if you look at the capacity of organization to meet the demand for services, I mean, 24% said that they had an increased capacity to meet the demand. So there's a bit of a discrepancy here, right, between the proportion of organizations that say that they face an increase in demand and the proportion of organizations that say, I have an increased capacity to meet that demand. And, you know, if you look at the one, so only a small proportion, so 9.5%, or close to 10% said that the demand for their services has decreased, right? And that seems to be a little bit more in line with those that said that they have a decreased capacity to meet the demand, right? So interesting slide, I think, and shows that the footprint of the nonprofit sector is increasing, but the capacity to meet that demand is not necessarily increasing in the same pace. So we'll move over to this is this is the end of the numbers for now. So let's just take a break from the number, and this is also an important slide for you. If you want to access the analysis that we did of the results in the daily, then you can click on the link that will be there in this presentation. We released all this analysis as well as all the tables associated with the survey results on March 20th, 2023. So that's for that. The infographic, we also released an infographic, right, which was released in April 2024, and it's something that you can easily circulate within your respective networks. And we also have a good article from Imagine Canada on the results that I invite you to also have a look at. So that's for the results of the survey per se. So in the next few slides, I will discuss a few more initiatives that this organization is doing in the area of the nonprofit. So we do have the Rural Canada Nonprofit Dashboard. So we did use the business register, again, to identify nonprofit organizations that are deemed as active, meaning that they declared revenues and they declared a positive number of employees. And so we did that for another organization in the federal family, but it is very granular. So it does provide information down to as you can see, a more granular geographical units of observation. And so it provides you with a sense of what's happening in the outside of major metro areas. So I invite you to have a look at this. We did release this product in February. And I believe, yes, so the reference years are for 2019 and 2020, and shows, in fact, the power of alternative sources of information, administrative information, what we can do with the registry that we receive, right? So that's perhaps a glimpse into the future of data collection, in fact, for the nonprofit sector. And I imagine will be maybe something that we will discuss during the conversation portion of this webinar. The next slide is about a survey, another survey, which is conducted in this organization, a survey that I like a lot because it does provide a wealth of information about so many different issues. And unfortunately, I mean, the results that are there are dated a bit. You know, the reference year is 2018, so we don't do that survey every year. But at least we're conducting that survey on a regular basis. And what it does is that we ask a representative sample of Canadians about their volunteering activities. And so, for example, in 2018, we had 12.7 million people that volunteered for charities, okay? These people provided 1.7 billion hours, okay, into formal volunteer activities, and this translates into 863,000 jobs, okay? So if these people were to be employed, this is how many jobs this would be, right? Close to 900. So I wonder what the results of the next iteration will be. The good news is that we're in collection or close to probably even finished the collection recently. The results will be released sometime in 2025. So I would say stay tuned. But I think we'll again provide another wealth of information that I believe will be very useful for the nonprofit sector. So let's move on to the last product that I wanted to highlight, which is a satellite account. And the satellite account is very useful. You do have a link there to the interactive tool that they have. And if you see the trend, right, and just have a look at the column for now, I mean, the trend shows that over the past, and by the way, these statistics are produced on a quarterly basis, which is very useful, right? So it's very timely. And so it does show that the sector has increased in size, right? The importance of the sector, the economic importance of the sector has risen in the past 3 years. Now we are at a 230 billion size in terms of the economic contribution, which, as I said earlier in this presentation, represents 8.4% of GDP. So you do have in the interactive tool all the information about number of employees, for example, the revenues, the GDP, the number of organizations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I invite you to have a look at this. This is also a very useful, a very interesting source of information for the sector. Provides a good overall sense, in fact. And then, so for those of you that are interested in the big picture, right? I mean, so this is, you don't have these numbers by, for example, like, this is not granular, right? Not too granular in terms of, but really does provide you with a sense of, okay, so if you need to communicate what is the size of the sector and the importance of the area in which I'm working, well, this is the place to go, right? And provides you all with all this information. So I think I'm going to stop there. I think I went over time by a few minutes, but I'm going to hand it over to Kathy, and guess we'll get started with the questions.
Yes, and thank you very much for that presentation, Sébastien. lots of great info, and we've got lots of questions coming through the Q&A as well. If you missed the top of the webinar, just a reminder that we're taking questions through the Q&A component of the webinar, not the chat. There's some conversation going on in the chat, but the question I'm going to be drawing from the Q&A. So if you have a question you want answered by Sébastien, please put it in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to get to it. So we've got a few questions. The ones that are there now are ones that were kind of coming in as you were talking, so that they relate to specific things you were saying. Sometimes without a whole lot of context, so we'll have to do our best to remember what might have been happening at the webinar or in the webinar at the time. The first one is, do social enterprises fall under business nonprofits?
Oh, can I turn it over to my friend Samantha, my colleague, who might be much better positioned than me to answer that question? I mean, Samantha, do you know the answer to that question?
I believe that these social enterprises would be considered part of the business institutions.
Because remember, this is not for-profit organizations, right? So we do have a definition here that I can read to you, and this maybe will help a bit. So remember that we're following international standards, right? And so what this includes is registered charities, so the T3010 data file, nonprofit institution, the T1044 file. We have tax-exempt corporation, T2 corporate income tax returns, and the generalized index of financial information. And the public sector bodies eligible for rebates under the GST system. So this is a bit technical, but might help you, in fact, identify. Yeah, I'm seeing and that's the thing, right? I mean, we're working with a definition that has to be based on tax. So and because we need to follow certain standards. I can investigate that a little bit more because that's a good question. And but again, I mean, these are the strict definition that we're following.
Thank you for that answer. I know that was kind of a technical question, probably wasn't fair to start off with, but I thought it was it is one of those ones that comes up frequently. A second question, probably a little easier for you to answer. Were you able to break down nonprofits versus charities by categories? For example, what percentage of community nonprofits versus community charities fall within each employee buckets? Or what percentage of sports and rec organizations are nonprofits versus charities?
Samantha, we have this information, don't we? I mean, we certainly have estimates of the registered versus non-registered charities. I don't know if we do the disaggregation of charity by type publicly, at least. But Samantha,
you're muted, Samantha.
Sorry about that. We have it as registered charities and then all other nonprofits. So we don't disaggregate further down from registered charities. Okay. So we're not crossing these information, but we just keep the two separate. So we have other nonprofits and then registered charities. And within the data tables that we have on Coder, that is a category that we're able to separate if we want to see counts for a particular table.
Thank you, Samantha.
Thank you. There's a question around what is the age group considered for youth, please? Now, I think the only time we mentioned youth was in relation to population served. So I think the answer is probably that was left up to the respondent, but
that is left up to the respondent, yes. So, yeah. Respondents then were left to use their judgment, I suppose. But you're right. I mean, in certain cases could be young adults. Certain other cases could be children. Mm-hmm. So it's not entirely clear exactly. Like there's no specific cutoff because sometimes the definition of youth can vary. I've seen, for example, with certain studies, you will say that, I don't know, I'm looking at the young employed population, which could be aged 18 to 29, to be perfectly honest, right? And so that includes a few adults in that context. So yes, it's not impossible that organizations that are dedicated to young adults could be included in it.
In the children and youth category, yes.
Correct.
What about the territories? Do we have information from the three territories in this data?
I don't think so, Samantha, because I
No,
believe the
that was
CSBs.
information that
Yeah.
we weren't able to get that level from. So we focus it on the regions, provinces.
Right.
Can you maybe explain a little bit more why that is? Like why because I think this is a question we hear a lot, especially from
Yeah.
organizations in the territories. Why are we so frequently excluded from these types of data collection efforts?
It
Maybe
is a
just
very
provide a little context about why that is.
it's a very good question, Kathy, and our apologies in advance, of course, to because we always prefer to release information along the lines of provincial boundaries. However, um, in the context of limited resources, if we want to have estimates for every single province, which includes provinces that have a smaller population, then we really need to boost the sample size, right? If we wanted to stay within the boundaries of the cost parameters that I have been assigned to, we had, like I said before, we had to limit ourselves to a sample of 8,000 organizations. So the problem with that, or the issue with that, it's not a problem, it's an issue, is that it does limit fairly significantly our ability to generate quality estimates for the smaller geographical units. And so the problem with that is that if we did publish results by province, then for many of the provinces, we would have had results that are in fact too unreliable to be published from a quality standpoint, right? So because it always goes down to statistical quality. It means that the number I provide, let's say I provide a 25% rate, right? But it can be anywhere between 2% and 65%. So it doesn't mean anything, right? If we were to release this information, right? The variance of that estimate is simply too large. So that's my, I guess, very, very, very high level way of describing it. So if we were to, and typically in many of the surveys that we do, where we have to release information by province, then we do have to have a much larger sample size than that. And what you need to understand is that the link between the cost of a survey and a sample size is very direct. And we're not immune, I guess, from inflationary pressures as well. The cost of surveys have gone up, and so sample sizes means that the cost is increasing with exponentially when we increase the sample. So all this to say, we did our very best, right, to disaggregate, and we had choices to make. We wanted to have the 13 sector, the types. That was, of course, we we relied on good advice for that it was critically important to have information by type, right? It was critically important to have information also by employment size, because a hospital, like I said in the presentation, a hospital with thousands of people employed in it is facing a completely different reality than a small organization with no employees in it, involved in the sports sector. So, and again, I mean, to go back to the 13, and then the sports and arts and recreation, and it's totally different from health. So we wanted to have at least that level of disaggregation. And then for the regional aspect, we decided to keep it at 6. 6 means, I believe, Atlantic provinces are grouped together. Quebec, Ontario, I think it's Manitoba, Saskatchewan together, Alberta, and BC.
Yes.
Samantha, you will correct
me. Manitoba, Saskatchewan are grouped, and then we have Alberta and BC, and then we do actually have the territories grouped for this project. So Atlantic provinces are grouped, Manitoba and Saskatchewan are grouped, and the territories are grouped, and then the remainder are individual provinces, just based on size and sample that we're able to get from the regions.
So the territories were included?
They are, yes.
They are, okay.
Yeah.
But we couldn't separate them out.
Separate them out, yes.
Right? So, because again, I mean, the number there would probably, would be, in fact, be quite small.
Right. You mentioned in one of the slides the sources of funding, and
yes.
provincial government funding was one of the ones you mentioned. There's a question about federal funding. Do you happen to know what the proportion of how federal funding fit into the picture in terms of its importance for nonprofits and charities?
Just give me
Samantha,
one
was
moment.
federal
Pull up that
funding
information.
okay? And was federal funding one of the sources of funding that was mentioned in the questionnaire?
It was, yes. So we had it broken down, federal, provincial, and territorial, municipal, and then other sources of government funding. So where we said provincial and territorial governments had about 10.5% of the funding for government overall. Federal was 4.5%, and then municipal was 2.8%. 1.1% represented other sources of government.
So I think everybody sees who the real expert is in this room. So, but keep in mind, however, that these are primary sources of funding, right? So there are many instances where, in fact, organizations are funded by various, and so we don't have that. But we ask about the primary source of funding because that was an easy way to get at a profile of the nonprofit sector in that area. I just wanted to mention that as well. So it's not 4.7% are funded by federal funds. It's 4.7% are primarily funded by federal funds.
Great. Here's a bit of a more technical question. So what is the actual sample frame? Who and how were potential respondents invited, approached to participate in the survey? Maybe I'll leave it those, and then there's a couple other points, but I'll let you answer those two first.
The way it works is that we build a frame from the business register. So we have a register in this organization of all association and organization, profit and non-profit organization in the country. We work with methodologists to extract a frame on the basis of the 4 definition I just read you a few minutes ago, right? I mean, so if we take that as a frame, right, and we ask the methodologists to make sure that the sample is representative of the type, size, and regions that we determine, and then we build a frame based on these with the help of methodologists. Based on that, we identify businesses that are to be contacted by our collection services. Get in touch with them, and they answer an electronic survey that they submit. And in this case, was part of the same, like I said, like that was part of the infrastructure of the Canadian Survey on Business Conditions. So essentially, we already have the sample for the Canadian Survey on Business Condition, but we built a new and different sample, a module, which was essentially a survey within a survey, to get to a representative sample of all nonprofit organization within this country. Okay, so it needs to be understood that way. So the module is representative not of businesses. The module is representative of the nonprofit sector, period. And so it is using the same infrastructure, but allows us to have a completely different frame. And so that's the beauty of it, is that we're using the same infrastructure in terms of collection, in terms of processing, in terms of treatment, and in terms of dissemination, but we can play with the frame. And so that's a very, very powerful tool, because we can do what we did for the nonprofit sector, we could do for any sector. We could do that for any industry. We could do that for pretty much any other area or type of business in this country. And so this is something that we're building. In fact, I want to say this is that the nonprofit module was definitely an example, right? And we think this is going to be an inspiration, in fact, for other types of survey that are going to be conducted within this organization using the same type of infrastructure. So again, and that is potentially also the future of surveys, given the fact that costs are increasing. We do have to use infrastructure and be a little bit more cost efficient in that sense. And so that's how we were able to generate it. The other thing that I want to mention in passing is that using the infrastructure allowed us to be a lot more timely. So typically, if we had to do a survey from scratch, meaning that we have to generate a completely new questionnaire and a new collection system and all the rest of it, and go through the consultation and the testing. We did go through testing for these questions, but I mean, that's less work because the number of questions is limited and the infrastructure already exists. But essentially, we went from collection to dissemination in a matter of weeks. Right? So we were in the field at the beginning of the year in 2024, and we were able to release this information on March 20th, 2024. So that shows the flexibility of the thing, and so allows you to have timely information. So that was one of the massive advantages we had with that. And so
one kind of related question is how is the individual that responds on behalf of the organization selected, or
again, good question.
What instructions are given for that?
So Samantha, maybe you can help me there, but essentially we ask a person that is knowledgeable, right, of the organization to answer, but it's one person, of course. We're not sending a questionnaire to all the board members, right? We do have one person that answered a survey in the name of the organization, but it has to be somebody that has the knowledge, presumably somebody that is part of the board, in fact, and has the knowledge to answer the questions for the entire organization. Because remember, when we ask about, yes.
And do they have to answer the question? They have to answer for the organization that's been selected for the survey, right? They can't just pick, because sometimes people are involved in more than one organization. But the survey is for the organization, so that's who they have to respond to, correct?
So I do have the simple answer from my chief of special survey. We're targeting a senior manager in the organization who can speak on behalf of the organization.
Right.
So it's not necessarily a member of the board, granted. Sometimes you have an employee or senior manager that is an executive director, right, of the organization that has all this information and answer in the name of the organization. But yeah, it's one person.
And when they receive the link to complete the survey, this is where they would find that information. So it would say a senior manager from this organization and have the individual organization that we are looking for a response from.
And I would like to thank not only Samantha, but my the Chief of Special Survey, Chris Johnston, who happens to be on the call.
There's a question about, is it possible to get data selected by province, territory, and by primary activity?
Yes. So by region, right?
Right.
So the tables are organized by region and by primary activity. So you can see what's happening in region A, primary activity Z. So keep in mind that this is not, well, if your region is Quebec, then Quebec is a province.
Right.
Right. But
the business register was mentioned. Can you publish the register of federally incorporated nonprofit organizations similar to the list of charities that is already available?
Well, that's a larger question that we would have to look at. We do, I mean, like I showed the what we call the rural dashboard of nonprofit organization, right? This is an example of the use of that register and we put that in a dashboard in a hub, in fact, where you can access this information. Now it's always going to be aggregated. right? Like we cannot publish a list for confidentiality reason. We would never publish a list. I mean, we would release in some way. I mean, it has to be released in a way that respect the confidentiality provisions of the Statistics Act always. So Samantha, I don't want to, if you want to chime in on that, but that was
The
not
business
part of.
register is not something that we publish, but we can provide a list of organizations and organization types that we have sampled or we're targeting for this survey, if that is desired.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, we are not able to provide that as long as the business register. We don't have we can't provide the aggregate information of what organizations, but we can provide the type.
I think you know that there's a lot of interest in the nonprofit sector in having a list of nonprofit organizations.
But you will not have a list of with names and you know what I mean? Like that how everything we do has to be aggregated. Okay, you know, in some way,
but we
shape,
do
or
for charities, right? So I know from Statistics Canada we won't, but that's the interest, right? Because there is an accessible list of registered charities.
right.
Yeah, and we don't have that for nonprofits. So that's where that question is coming from. I think that there's an intense interest in having a list of nonprofits that is available for other researchers to use, etc.
Right.
There's a question. Can you publish more crosstab details about the characteristics of nonprofits versus charity organizations in a dashboard? We have all the Tree 3010 data, but we can't say much about nonprofits because we don't have any details. So is there any, and there's some other questions that are related to that. Are there plans to publish more data? I think with working at the tables, you can get a fair amount about nonprofits by.
You can.
Yeah. But is there any effort underworks to do more about that?
So the data's there, right? Okay, so that's the first thing I want to mention. So of course we published what we had in terms of the answer to the question. We did choose to organize the data in a certain way. Samantha, you confirmed the data is available by registered charity versus other types of
other
nonprofit.
nonprofits. Yeah.
So we do have that, right? And so you can have a look at these numbers first, and so that's what I would encourage to do. What I would say is that if you if you have ideas of additional other ways that the information could be disseminated, feel free to reach out and tell us, right? And if also you have an idea on what I would say research questions, right, that we could address. I'm not saying we have we have a finite amount of resources, of course, but I want to keep an eye open on what other types of analytical insight and contribution we can make to exploit this data a little bit more. And of course, we want the conversation to continue with the external advisory group and the coalition, right? And see what else can be done in the future with either that data or other ideas for future collection if we go down that route. It's just not quite clear to me exactly what kind of resources are going to be available in the near future if we were to do a repeat or for what other types of products we can do. That said, I'm really looking forward to that next conversation with the external advisory group, right? Because I think, and I said that in a previous webinar, that I don't think that the future of collection is only surveys. We tend to think, I believe that, and I think we've been trained, and that includes myself, that a survey is the answer to all of the questions. Not necessarily. I think we're and we just had this conversation about the business register. How can we exploit maybe other types of collection strategies? Might include linkages, for example, right? How can we, examine alternative sources of information to generate additional insights of the sector outside of the survey instruments, right? And so again, and it's not just a question of cost effectiveness, right? It's a question also of the future. Because we had a fairly good response rate for that survey, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it will always be the case. So I think we
Well, I
have
think
to.
you can see there's a lot of interest in
Yeah, yeah.
within the sector on more data. We didn't unfortunately have time to get to all the questions,
Oh, it's free.
but we will do our best to follow up with folks whom we didn't get to your questions. I want to thank Sébastien for joining us today and for all the work that Statistics Canada did on the survey, fully recognizing that there's lots of more things we could do and lots more questions people have, but we're certainly grateful to have this information, which is the first update of some of this information that we've had in more than 20 years, it's pretty great to have. And we appreciate you sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us. Thanks also to everyone who joined us today for your interest in this. I think demonstrating to Statistics Canada and others how much interest there is in the nonprofit sector in data is very important. So I thank you for your participation today. This is the last of several webinars that the Federal Nonprofit Data Coalition has hosted this spring. They've all been exceptionally well attended, so thank you to all who've attended those, and I believe the recordings are available if you missed them. A reminder, if you are interested in joining the Federal Nonprofit Data Coalition, it's a free and open group, and everybody who's interested is welcome to join. And you can do that by emailing us at publicpolicy@imaginecanada.ca. And thank you very much. And thanks again to Sébastien and to Samantha.
Thank you. Have a good
Thank
rest of
you.
the day. Bye now.